Welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Navé, always airing first on WPVM LP Asheville 103.7 and streaming online, WPVMFM.org. The voice of Asheville heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio, coming out of Taos, New Mexico. Hey, thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song. WalterParks.com for more on Walter's music. Davine Dial, thank you for managing WPVM FM in Asheville, and Robin Collier for doing the same out in Taos, KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio. I do appreciate that. If you'd like to reach me, Navé at jamesnavé.com. Navé is spelled Nave, Navé at jamesnavé.com. So today I have a friend on whom I've known a bit of time. Her name is Ashlee Haze. She's based in Atlanta. And the reason I've invited Ashlee to come is because she's one of the spoken word artists who lives in Atlanta. And when I use the word spoken word, I am thinking of poetry, of course, the spoken word poetry, but also podcast, different kinds of performances, public speaking, anything that has to do with one's words being spoken. So I'm really excited to have Ashlee on. She's been one of the slam poets at the Leaf Poetry Slam Festival over the years. She's not able to make it this fall, but she has agreed to be with us today on Twice 5 Miles Radio. So Ashlee, welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio.
Thank you so much for having me, Navé. What a pleasure to sit with you. I haven't seen you in quite a bit.
Well, it's been a while, and we can just sit together and enjoy each other's company in this conversation. I know that I've seen you on stage, and you really do a terrific job on the stage. You got the high slam scores, but slam is not the only thing in the world. In fact,
Yeah.
it's just a sliver of what people do. So I'd love for you to start by giving us a sense of what you do in Atlanta, how you engage the creative birthright that you've had all your life that you've been working with. What kind of messages do you put out? How do you help people? What makes you curious?
Yeah.
Start anywhere. Tell us what's going on.
Yeah, so I always identify as a poet first. So poet slash spoken word artist. What does that mean? That means that my first medium is the writing of poems. That was my first means of expression, and it is still very much home for me. Performing on stage is probably the thing I do the most of in a year. So it's probably the thing I get paid for the most, if I'm being honest. And then I've written poetry books. So usually I'm selling those. And then when I'm not doing that, I have a lot of connections with my local communities and arts organizations. So I do a lot of curating where I pick some of my favorite artists and we maybe have a theme for a particular event or we have a partnership with a particular city. Like I've been working with the city of Roswell now for going into our fourth year for programming for Black History Month that we've expanded into National Poetry Month. So it's my job to be where the art is. And then beyond art, I also do artistic marketing or poetic marketing, as I call it, where I use poetry to tell corporate stories and to aid brands in their storytelling. I was a copywriter for an agency for a little over a year, and I wrote what was in the brand guidelines. And I said, well, what if I kind of helped guide the brand guidelines? Or what if the brand guidelines didn't have to be adhered to so strictly, where there was a space where art meets marketing? And we hear music and marketing oftentimes, but I think what makes me unique is my background in poetry and spoken word. And so it was during the COVID pandemic, actually, and the election of 2020 that I was taken off stage, obviously involuntarily. So stage was home for me. And I said, well, what the heck else am I going to do? I had a lot of things on my list. I'm like, I probably could go work at the post office, go back to city government. And I did. I went back to city government for a minute. But I said, no, it's got to be something else. So I said, well, what if I just, use these mics? I had mics hanging around from a podcast. And I said, well, maybe voiceover could be cool. Maybe I can record poems or I can write poems for people and record them as voiceover. And I've been doing that for the past 4, going into my 5th year of voice marketing. And then that turned into producing podcasts and educational workshops. So really, I'm a media girl. But the fundamental of it all is changing the world one word at a time, however that happens.
I'd like to go a little more into the idea of copywriting, marketing, and
Yeah.
poetry. You say you use poetry in the work you do to create copy for brands. Now, when you are using poetry to do that, are you using your poetic knowledge, your poetic disposition, allowing that sensibility, the poet's sensibility, to come up with layered ideas that someone else might not notice? Is that how it works? I'm being a little
Yeah, I mean that's
intellectual
part of
here,
it.
but
Yeah, it's definitely partly that, but part of it is act like I had a brand last week. I actually wrote a poem for them and they hire me to write poems based on their branding guidelines. Sometimes I record them as voiceovers and they use them as media spots. I have some companies that I work with where they may have me write a poem based on a conference theme and I come read the piece as the kickoff to their conference to sort of add an artistic moment that maybe the audience isn't expecting, and to also express their themes through the lens of poetry. So it's all of that. Some of it is nuanced. The public may see it as just a very good written copyright, but I know that it's poetic. But some of it is the actual translation of poetry to the medium.
so when you use your skills to create these pieces, you, I imagine, have quite a range in terms of how you employ it. And I'm thinking now, when people hear the word
Yeah.
poetry, they think, oh, highbrow poems, the great poems that were written
Hmm.
from the great poets, which are indeed very strong. They hold up. How do you massage the language so that it becomes more understandable by the people that are listening and still staying poetic?
Well, luckily for me, I never began in a White Tower. My poetry's never been academic in that lens. My academic work, actually, I intentionally kept very separate from my poetry for a long time. So my poetry is nitty gritty. It's slam, it's open mic, it's, the bar where you're trying to get people outside to come in for a poetry slam so you have enough people. So I think more than a pivot, it's my default. My default is accessible language poetry that is not so highbrow that you need, a thesaurus next to you to understand it. It has always been for me communicating with the people and more to the majority than the minority of folks. And, do I have some academic pieces? Sure. My poet published in poetry.org? Sure. But usually when I'm writing for public consumption, it is those tools that I learned in slam and open mic that I'm applying there.
And the reason I'm pursuing this a bit, people listening to this show tend to, as many people do, get all bundled up in the idea of the great poems. That's what I have to do, rather than turning their attention to what's going on right in front of them and letting their poetic sensibilities that they were born with play out in however they work the language in the moment, rather than trying to be the next great A-list poet somewhere in the cosmic
Yeah.
stratosphere.
Yeah, and the thing is that, that was great then. Would it be great now? What do we consider great now? I think of someone who has an eye for form, but also an ear to the world and to politics and justice and how that merges. I think also just the concept of poet, because I see poet as a public servant, the way I see a deputy or sheriff or any other public servant position. That's how I see it for myself. And so that means that it's my job to reflect the experiences of the people I'm in community with. And if I'm doing that well, at this time in 2024, it's likely not going to be what Frost might have written in his time, sure.
Well,
Or Poe,
what is that line? Whose woods these are? I think I know, and I think I know it won't be what Frost wrote in New Hampshire. So, talk to us about the reasons why you do this. 2024, there's a lot going on in the
Mhm.
world, and we can go down the list of all the things that we all know happening out there. What are your objectives? Why do you do poetry? You mentioned public service, like people that show up to put the fires out, or the emergency services that knock on the door and save your grandmother, take her away to better health, or hopefully. Why do you do this? What's driving you?
Well, I always tell people I'm my first audience. So I wrote poetry in service to me, if I'm being honest, to begin with, was 10 years old and a lot going around me and, stricter rules at home of what I could and couldn't say. But poetry, I could say the things, I could be free, I could get them. So for first, it's catharsis. It's to get it out of my body and to process it. And then beyond that, the sharing of it is in hopes that it serves as catharsis to someone else. Because yes, emergency services save your life. I've had a poem save mine. I don't know about you. I've had a poem be the light that I wake up for where things might have otherwise been dark. And so I do that to tell my story, to tell the stories of the people that I'm in community with, that my stories of my ancestors' stories, of what's happening in my immediate life. And then I share them in hopes that it reflects in some way the experiences of others.
So, how has a poem saved your life? What does that mean?
Woohoo! It means you encounter the thing and it's, the thing that maybe you couldn't write or didn't know how to write or were in too much of a funk to write. One of the poems I think of immediately is a poem called In Case You Ever Need It, It Is Here by a poet named Daphne Gottlieb. And I found it in a book that I think somebody gave me. It was a book for young girls, actually, and I came to it because Gypsy O, a poet from Leaf, had a poem in it, and I encountered it. It's a poem where I think the first few lines are, "Take this, rip this out of the book, so that in case you ever need it, it is here." And even just beginning a poem with like, look, this is the poem that you're going to carry with you. And literally, I think at some points I've had it printed out and pinned to a board, but it essentially reminds you that you are more than whatever this moment is. Your body is not just pain, it is yours. Your life is yours. And so I think of encountering that in a time where maybe I didn't think my life was mine, where it seemed like it belonged to, so many other people or to capitalism or to whatever is oppressive at the time. And to be reminded of that. I think oftentimes of Sandra Cisneros' work and one last poem for Richard when I was going through a really bad breakup. And just to see that a poem could be gentle to even a traumatic event or a person that you didn't have the best relationship with, and that there could be a lens where you're on the other side of it. So they have been in service to me and perhaps didn't know or intend to be.
I've seen your work at Leaf. You've performed for the Slam, and I know you do a lot of work. I watched your Tiny Desk concert with
Oh, wow, thanks.
NPR. You have that on your website as well. Your work is mostly memorized, or what I've seen you do is
Mhm.
memorized. Would you reflect a bit on your relationship with memorization and why that's a significant part of the work you do, building out the material that you want people to receive?
I started in slam, and I think my very first slam, I read my poem off paper and my opponent performed it memorized. And I was like, that's the thing that I gotta do, right? Like I had in my head that that's what winners do. Of course, that myth was soon after debunked. But memorization for me is more about an approach to craft than it is any sort of validation. I approach my stage performance a lot more similar to theater, so in the way that an actor would memorize lines. And what you can do when the poem, as I like to say, lives in your body and the way that it translates. You can literally hear the difference when I'm reading words and reading and then saying them, than when I know them. Because then when I know them, it's not even about the words, it's about my hand movements or my inflection of my voice or where my body is positioned, the distance from the microphone. Now I'm thinking about more technical things to really tell the story. So that is why I memorize. I use it as a tool. I have some poetry readings where I'm holding the book the entire time. And I had a mentor come to a show where I read, like I did a mixture of both. And he was like, you should have memorized those poems. And I'm like, that's not the only way to do it either. Sometimes I love the intimacy of sitting on stage and inviting the audience into an imaginary living room. And now we're just doing a poetry reading. And then I may end on this big theatrical note. So it adds dynamics to my work as well.
One of the reasons why I love it when poets who have great skill in memorizing and performing step back and just take it easy with the book in hand, it reminds the listeners there are many, many ways to go about this. Not
Yep,
everybody wants
absolutely.
to throw themselves into these long haul memorization projects that requires a great deal of attention, thought, preparation, and on it goes. And then you have to dance between, do I remember? Do I forget? Am I any good? Am I not any good? All these things that bounce around while you're trying to finally get the thing up to performance level. That's not required to have a poem save you, is it?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. There are poets who I admire that I almost always see with paper, because that's where they live. I don't think that you have to do that in order to have an impactful performance.
I agree. I've seen plenty in both directions. In fact, I've seen memorized pieces performed by poets in a way that's driven so hard that it becomes one note and you turn off.
Exactly. You've had that where perhaps reading the words might give both of us an opportunity to let the words breathe and give it a second, and
Yeah.
sometimes our minds are weird. I remember earlier in slam, I would just go in overdrive where whatever I practiced at home, somehow it's not what's happening on stage. I'm hollering, I'm going way too fast. I go back and listen to some of those slam poems. I'm like, who was rushing? Why was I talking so fast? Whereas if I'd had the paper, I would have been invited and probably forced to take a minute, breathe. Just like anything, there's balance.
And I often will say to people, and I've said this before on the show when I'm having these conversations with poets like you, people will say to me, I don't perform my poetry, I read my poems. And it occurred to me that the only way to really read a poem on stage is to sit there quietly and read it and let people
Hmm.
watch you read it, but you're not saying anything. The moment you open your mouth, you're performing. You may not be doing very well at it, but you're still doing it. And I
Yeah.
love that distinction. Absolutely. So on that note, I'm wondering if maybe you might offer us a sample of what you do as a poet. We would love to hear it.
Oh, wow. Let's
Oh,
see.
you
I
weren't
could have
expecting
been.
that one, were you?
Well, since I just mentioned it, I did have a poem published in Poetry Magazine, I'm actually really proud of, called Temple from my book Smoke. When I was writing this poem, I was in a poetry workshop, I think with the poet Angel Nafis. The prompt was to write a poem where you use a theme that shows up often in your work, but you use it a different way in each stanza. The theme that shows up probably most often in my work is church and religion. I was raised in the church and then departed from religion as its fixed structure. I'm going to read this poem called Temple. The pastor says we are having church, and I begin to wonder what it means to possess a thing you cannot touch. I caught the Holy Ghost once after chasing him in the back pews. I held on to him long enough to convince my mother of salvation, then went home and set him free in the wild. How pompous of man to think himself temple. Don't you know I have called out to God in emptier structures? The doors of the church are open. Come, sit, lay your burdens at the altar. Eat the body and its crumbs. Sip the blood until you are satisfied. I am unlearning how to erect myself as a stained glass home. This pipe organ heart is guilty of calling out to the godless, but most especially the men who peak during prayer. So that's temple.
Well, the only problem with that is you have to stop. The men
Thank
who
you, Navé.
peak
That is a
during
high honor.
that is truly a great line to end with. The men who peak during practice. I wonder what they're looking for if they can't see God. What's around the corner?
Ooh, wee, right?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
what poetry does for you. It validates the curiosity that one has after the service is over.
Yeah, or during.
When you were reading this, you were animated. You clearly enjoyed it. Can you talk a bit about the imaginative activity that swirls around inside your mind and your body? The body is the instrument, it takes place throughout the body. What's that imaginative process like for you when you're engaging in a piece like this? Because we're doing this on a Zoom call, so I can see your face. Very animated. You were there, and the moment you started, I was sitting in the pew in the same church service. I could feel that church service. What's going on in your inside your imagination? How does it surprise you?
One, the approach to this poem is the theme changes with each stanza. It's important for me to also morph with it. And so to begin on a note that I can depart from, I don't want to begin on a note that I can't really get out of in the next section. And a lot of this is subconscious that you're now asking me to bring conscious, which is very cool. Because, I've been doing this for so many years. I'm like, what is the process when I'm doing a voiceover or reading, because both my spoken word voice is my instrument. So I think there's that. I'm also thinking about the meaning, like the meaning that I want you to take from it, how I want the inflection to be. In the first one, I'm being more inquisitive. But in the next two stanzas, I don't know if you pick up, I'm being a bit of an asshole. Like, what does it mean to catch the Holy Ghost? Like, I'm playing tag with him. And then I have one verse where it's a man thinking that he's holier than a temple. And I'm like, there are places I can call out to God that aren't you. And so, I'm being a little snarky in language. So I want the listener to pick up on it. I want them to know that my intentions have changed. And then once I get towards the end, there's a bit of, accusation and a bit of grief and a bit of invitation, and also a bit of call out. Unfortunately for me, I do like the guys who aren't paying attention during church. Like, and what does that mean for me? So I think that I've grown past that, but that's what was going on in the poem. So I think that for me, it is always what I want the audience to feel, and I want them to feel those moments happening, even if they don't notice it.
Well, I think you're touching on the right word, feel. When I was listening, I could feel it. I'm not exactly sure when the beat changes from one intention to the next. On the surface, I'm not sure. But in the feeling, I do let it sink in. So much of what we do in this relationship we have with poetry, reading on the page into the imagination, or hearing you read it coming into my imagination and going off to church myself, happens on those deeper layers. And there's an ease that you brought to it. So I didn't
Oh, thank
feel
you.
any pressure. I didn't feel like, oh my God, I have to understand this because Ashlee's like getting way ahead of me. It's like, okay, I'm there. I can feel the air. I can hear the music. I'm in there. I know what she's talking about. And that's the end of the poem for me, the sense of it. But all those layers are built in there somewhere, I think.
Yeah, this was a poem that I wrote knowing that I wanted to push the bounds with page poetry, with poetry the listener might not necessarily be hearing me read. And so I really enjoyed playing with that. So thank you.
Yeah. Do you by chance have another one you could offer us? I have a lot of other questions for
Ah,
you, but I'd love to hear one more because we've got a taste of what you do. And I'm probably not the only one out there thinking about this.
see. Let's see. Oh, this one's probably cool. This is a foreign poem. So we talk about like academy and modern poetry. Jericho Brown is a modern poet who is in the academy but speaks well of modern experiences, Nobel Prize winner. I think he might have been the first modern poet that I heard to create a form. And so he has created a form called the duplex, which is very bluesy in nature. So the duplex is a type of form poem based in couplets. I took a stab at it, and actually I'm gonna read you the form so that the listener has to reference it. So the duplex is a form composed of seven couplets with 9 to 11 syllables per line. The second line of each couplet is echoed in the first line of the following. And the first line of the poem is also echoed in its last. And so the form was invented by Jericho Brown. He called it a gutted sonnet, part guzzle, part blues poem. And so he meditated on the sonnet form and devised this poetic form. And so I wrote one after Jericho Brown's poem Duplex. The men who miss me call me on a full moon. I answer to see if they have found God. I answer to see if they have found God. To find God is to return to the truth. He returns to the truth, but does not stay long. Some of us still believe in miracles. I believe in miracles, but men still lie. What are the symptoms of forgiveness? Here is what I know of forgiveness. To forgive does not mean to love again. The men I love again are the men who change. In the dream, my lover chooses me. In the dream, my lover chooses me. On a full moon, he calls to say he misses me.
Beautiful.
Well, that was my stab at the duplex for.
Storytelling, poetry telling, poetry performance. Reflect a bit on the nuances of those three ideas: poetry performance, poetry telling, storytelling. Do you see any difference?
Ah, yeah, I mean, that can be different. So I think, poetry telling, actually, that's a term that's new for me. So I usually use storytelling or poetic performance. So that sort of seems to be in the middle of the two, which is interesting to me. But performance to me is just that it is there's elements, voice, body, something that is giving dimension to this poem. Whereas storytelling, I'd be a good storyteller and never perform the stories that I write, but they're written well. As an auditory storyteller, to me, they're almost seamless. It is taking the poetry and the story of it. I am a big fan of a beginning, middle, and end. So a lot of my poems double as stories. For me, I take a similar approach to both. What's the beginning, middle, and end? If we don't have a beginning, middle, and end, grappling with that, because oftentimes our human nature to be very confused when there isn't a beginning, middle, and end. We will fill it in ourselves. Storytelling for me is making sure that the listener gets the story and it feels completed. And if it doesn't feel completed, it feels as if we tried.
I first came on storytelling many years ago and started thinking about stories and then poems, and how so often when you hear poems presented, they're presented in a very different way than stories are presented. And the story is more told, the poem is a bit more formal. And I've been experimenting just with the notion of poems told as stories, which is not so
Mm.
slammy. Like the slam poem is driven really hard, so it's not told as a story, but the idea of a poem being almost a spontaneous story that you think of sitting on the porch rocking back and forth. Once upon a time, years and years ago when I was a boy, or just let it roll off a bit. So I love that idea. So that was why I asked the question, and that's where it comes from.
Oh yeah. Interestingly enough, I did that often in slam. Often my best poems were stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So let's shift a little bit as we move into the second half hour. I know that you have a podcast, that you work a great deal in the studio, as you've mentioned. A lot of people I encounter would like to do a podcast. They would like to be voiceover artists. Can you tell us a bit about how you go about producing your podcast? Can you tie a bit of the social media aspects into it? I'm asking this, and this isn't, I'm asking Ashlee Haze, the marketer, to put that hat on, because a lot of
Yeah.
people are clueless, or not clueless, but they think they're clueless about how do I get my word out. And then they throw themselves deeply into it and nothing happens. So how do you make that happen? And who do you call? Maybe you call Ashlee Haze. Hey, Ashlee, save me, save me. I don't know. Tell us
Well, if you
some of
call
that out
me.
there.
So the first things I like to lead with are the hard truth. Podcasts are going to be hobbies for most. They're not going to be revenue generating. Actually, I remember when I started and I was like trying to fundraise, I was like, podcasts can be expensive. And I'm like, yeah, if you do it that way. And also, it is not likely that I think a podcast has to have 50,000 downloads an episode average in order to be appealing to marketers for advertising dollars. So I tell people often it's probably not going to be the thing that you retire with or that is your primary source of income. So let's just start with reasonable expectations. Then beyond that, though, the idea of making a podcast that you even love doing part-time or as a hobby or that has the potential to work is based on community building. Who's your audience? What is the demographic? What is the point of the podcast? Why should they listen to you? And your first listeners are likely going to be people that you know, or people that you are in community with, or that follow the hashtags that you use. And speaking of hashtags, that's a social media tool. Social media for me is my primary form of media marketing, mostly because it works for everybody else. I do a video podcast. So I started with audio and I realized that people weren't necessarily responding to audio on social media. We're in a video generation. As soon as the radio show The Breakfast Club went video, I think that just completely changed the bar. So oftentimes what I find myself doing is recording a whole podcast, but sharing the best minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes repetitively on social media to try to get people to drive traffic there. But if you're just starting, you can start audio. I recommend that people start with lower stakes. Start at where you're at. If you have the resources, if you already have a camera to run a video podcast, you have mics, you have a set, fantastic, go for it. But if you don't, just start with a microphone. Start with going into a computer-based program. There are a lot of online, so I think Headliner, and there's another podcast production app. I just went USB into my computer and did that for a while. But I'm a product girl, so I wanted to increase the value of the product. So then I bought better microphones and started using a recording console. Then I said, well, why not let's try video and see what happens? And I got a videographer. We recorded it that way. It is definitely a longer, I usually consult people on podcasts, but just kind of the overhead of the process. But the bigger thing that I tell people, your podcast is your product. Oftentimes podcast is the marketing for the product and not the product itself. I think a lot of people confuse that. Think of a lot of podcasts you listen to. You're not listening to it for the sake of the podcast. You're listening to it to buy my book. My book is out now. My album is out now. That's always been the point of talk shows. I go on talk shows when I have a movie coming out or when I have an album coming out. So think of podcasts as a medium and what's on the other side of it. Are you as a coach on the other side of it? Are you coaching services on the other side of it? Is your guest media on the other side of it? Their books? Do you do it to help other people as sort of this clearinghouse for marketing? There's so many ways to approach it. And if it's just fun, if it's, your weekly conversation with your best friend that you just decided to record and put out, then just set your expectations accordingly. And maybe it will grow and maybe 50,000 people will find that really cool. But if not, it's probably going to be the community and people who listen to it. So I would say those are all sort of preliminary things to consider, which probably a lot in a short period of time.
Well, it is a lot. I'm going to also ask you to think about this. I've seen some of the work you do on your webpage and other things. It's clean.
Thank
You
you.
obviously know how to put something together and make it look good. So when I view it, I feel comfortable.
Thank you.
That doesn't happen in your sleep, Ashlee
No.
Haze. Somebody has to know how to
That's a
cut
lot of
video
sleep.
and how to do the audio and what kind of microphones to buy, how to write copies, you've already said, and all these other marketing things. How long did it take you to learn that? And I know you're learning every day. How can you not? Somebody's sitting out there thinking, I would love to do that, but my God, I have no skill in this at all, which is something that one must acquire. What kind of pacing is required? How much study do you recommend people to do? How do you go about learning some of these things?
I'll tell you what, it probably would have taken longer if I didn't know people who are already doing it. I tell people my biggest, I don't want to call it a shortcut, but what I think that I've used to my advantage to cut off a lot of time is that I will call people who are already doing the thing that I want to be doing. And so at the time I started my first podcast, my boyfriend was an audio engineer. So I literally just said, "Hey, what kind of microphone do I need for a podcast?" And he bought the mic and, hooked it up and all. Now, I did take a year of audio engineering class. So that's 1 year of education that I had. So I understood cords needed to connect and sort of bit rate and those sorts of things. Asked an expert who was able to then like immediately donate their services. And I've been doing that my entire career. Hey, I am trying to figure out, or I'll just Google and, YouTube University, how to produce a video podcast or how to record something. I think I had my best friend at the time who did that legwork for the video. And so it's like, we need this many cameras, this much memory cards. There's so much involved in video production. We need lighting. And I was like, whoa, we need a lot of those things. How much is that going to cost? Try to figure out how to get the money for it. So this is now years, probably my first audio podcast was 2015. I didn't produce my first video podcast until 2021. So we're talking 5 to 6 years of growth, of market research, of understanding how it goes. And even then, I would put out a podcast and I'd be like, oh, I've got to update the description. I've got to distribute it to YouTube. I've got to figure out the social media caption. So a few years definitely to figure out how to do it on my own. I probably could have bought a downloadable course and gotten to it faster, but it was a lot of putting the pieces together while I'm also doing other things. And that is for self-production. I tell people you could always just pay a company to do it. Now that I've done that, people pay my company to do it for them. So we've got there. But just realistically, we're talking hours and hours and finding experts who will teach you so that you can save a few hours here and there. But the doing is still going to be work.
The reason I'm asking, because I've been doing this podcast for 8 years, I was recording it in the field on the field recorder before COVID. COVID hit. I just kept going with Zoom calls like we're doing now. And I've discovered this little telephone call center mic, omnidirectional mic, and then
Yeah.
having you just come on and do the mic from a Zoom point of view seems to work well enough. I get the content. It's not the high level quality you have in your production, and yet it seems to work. I wonder as I'm sitting here, should I upgrade this? I'm just happy not making any money on this, enjoying the conversations, learning as I go.
It's a good question.
Look,
Um,
what do you recommend? I'm probing.
Well, I recommend you grow with the podcast. Now, one thing that I, had to learn how not to do was to overshoot my trajectory and grow too fast. And so scaling is, hey, I've got enough for this cool omnidirectional mic. Then I tell you, okay, when you get $400, I can tell you the best podcast mic. You will spend 400 bucks on it. You will never have to buy the microphone again. I can tell you how to do that. And is that's going to instantly boost your quality. But are you going to make any money for it? Are you going to be able to justify the expense? I think what makes me successful is that I'm also business minded. And so I think about that. I'm not going to rush to tell you to buy the industry standard podcast. It's called the Shure SM7B. And it's a $450 microphone plus the cord, and you have a field recorder. So you can go straight into there. You need a cloud booster. So that's a almost $600 expense. It's irresponsible of me to tell a business owner to make that expense if they don't have 600 bucks of income to justify it. So, if you're telling me this is not a revenue generating podcast, keep where you're at. Now, if you do see the investment and you think more people might listen if you have that microphone, then do it. But do it in a pace that feels comfortable with you. And this is for anybody running a creative business or business in general. That's just good sense. That's why I tell people treat the podcast as a hobby. And so if it's my hobby, maybe I do get some extra money and I say, okay, let me get a new shiny mic for this, but set your expectations accordingly. Don't go investing $2,000-3,000 an episode into a podcast and then you don't have an audience to watch it. So you are doing the right thing. You are building listenership. You're doing what you can with what you have. And that is how sustainable models are built.
And the goal of this podcast, which is really a radio show, it airs on 2 radio stations. So it does go public over the FM air, and it's community radio. Back to the idea of all of this is community. We're all gathered together in this together. And I like the idea of keeping it a bit low tech. And I haven't really gone in the direction of the video using
I was going to tell
Zoom.
you a quick, easy you could do, if I may.
Please do.
You could
Yes.
simply record the Zooms and push those to YouTube. A lot of podcasters do that.
But sometimes there's a lot of and duh and I don't know and pauses. So I've often thought, I'm not sure if I want to put that out as a video because I can't edit it, whereas I can edit the sound.
I'm a fan of AI. There are services that you upload the whole episode and it cuts all of that out. We can have a whole conversation about the ethics of AI and all that. There are AI services that can produce you 1-minute clips to post on social media. I usually tell people to start with Headliner. As a podcast startup, Headliner was my first place to go to. And they have different options, and some options you pay for. One service that I use is that I'll upload a video and it'll automatically distribute it to YouTube as a podcast. And you can caption your videos or transcribe it. So I'd start there. And then for larger editors, I don't have a reference right now, so I'd have to get one.
So I'm interested in all of this, and I hope people listening are interested. This is the direction I sometimes like these interviews to go. So just get in these little conversations between two people.
You kind of get a free
just,
consult.
well, I mean, it's all about free to me. Everything is it's good to give things away for free. What I've discovered in offering up many things that I do, I don't really charge for it, but I also have discovered that I get lots of interest, and the free turns into some of the best currency I've ever had because people do notice. And it is a good thing, I think, to do that. I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit more about AI. I use AI all the time. I use ChatGPT I've been using it since it came out 2 years ago, and I pay $20 a month for it. So I'm using the full tilt thing, and I get a lot of mileage out of that. So what about AI? How do you deal with that? And how does that work for you in your professional work?
So one thing about my ethics, and ethics is one of the pillars of my media production company, is that I use AI in post-production. I am not at the point where I'm willing to use it for production. So that means that I don't use it to write any of the words or generate any scripts or anything like that. For me, it comes in post. I can use it to make shareable clips of the episode, which I recommend for you. If you don't want to edit the whole episode, find your best 3 minutes in iMovie, move the end to that point, the beginning to that point, take that chunk and post it to YouTube and then put the link to the whole episode in the comments. Easier. Now you just have a little bit more of an audience and people can search in a different place. So I use it in post for sort of the editing. Captions. That was the first thing I used AI for. I found a service called Rev, REV Rev. And I would upload an episode and it would automatically give me a transcript or captions. Then I could take that and put it in YouTube because accessibility is important for me. I watch a lot of things with the captions on. Sometimes I watch social media videos on mute. So it's an accessibility measure, whether I'm in public and don't want to be loud or whatever. I like having captions available to people. So that was my intro into AI. And then somebody's like, yeah, you can use AI to cut up the episode or edit the episode. They're using AI now to where they can fix the placement of your eyes. So if you're not looking directly into the camera, it can make it look as if you are. So interesting to me. But that's sort of where my relationship is it in the post production and making sure that I don't have to sit and edit the entire video and do that the entire time or chop it up into bits on my phone and rebounce the whole video and type in all the captions. It is making that process a lot easier for me.
I had a job or a task. I'm working with Jennifer Pickering at the Leaf Global Arts, and we're putting together a book, curating a book. And she said, Navé, I have 2018 through 2024 quotes on spreadsheets, names and what people said, 100 quotes per year. Could you go through those, pull them out, and organize them so that we would have the quotes and the names all together so it'll be easy to read? And I went in and started to do it by hand, cut and paste. And then I realized I just copied the whole thing, put it in Chat GPT-4, and I said, could you organize in alphabetical order the names and the quotes of all these people? Do not change a word. Just give it to me in an order that's easy to read. 2
And it
minutes
did.
later, it was done. Boom, just like that. And I went through the entire series from 2018 to 2024. And it took about 3 hours to do it. It does take some organization, but it sped it up dramatically. So I've had lots of good results from ChatGPT. I don't use it to generate original work. I'm not saying
No,
do
I
this for
don't.
me, do that for me, but sometimes I will. If I have to write a blurb for a podcast, I'll write the blurb and then I'll say, go through this, keep it in my voice, my style, and my tone, and just clean it up. And it will clean it up, spit it back out, and it's very, very close to what I've already written. It's just cleaned up. So I use it for that kind of editing. And I'm really careful not to have it take my voice away.
Yeah, that's what I mean by I don't use it in production. I immediately thought of a program called Canva, and I know our time is winding down. But there's a program called Canva. Somebody said when we burn the rich, make sure we save the nice couple that made Canva, because they've made everything so easy in this one app. I'm not a graphic designer. Canva has templates for almost everything you can think of, but they have a new AI video feature where I can type in what I want marketing campaign to be about, and it will find found footage and compile like a visualization of what I've said. So I do think that there are certainly useful ways for AI, and if we're smart about it as producers,
Mm-hmm.
it really can maximize the reach and the extension of audiences.
Right. Yeah, I use Canva a lot. I use Sonic AI as my transcription service. I use a few other AI services like Grammarly. I use Grammarly. So I will check my spelling and check all my commas with Grammarly. So I'm pretty well involved in it. And all of this is to just say that if people out there listening would like to do this kind of work and scale it up, these are the kind of conversations that teach you how to do this. You and I haven't been the most fluent, smooth characters working through this, even in this conversation. We're exploring all the elements that are out there. Oh, you could do this, you could do that. You need to explore this. This might versus that might. So at the end of the day, I think you have to just love it. Otherwise, you might not stick with it. Is that
Yes.
true?
Absolutely. And I mean, I always tell people, like, why am I in show business again? Why am I in this? Oh, because I'm passionate about it and I love it and it means a lot to me. And if it doesn't mean a lot to you, then I would strongly question why are you doing it? Because if you're doing this for the money, I got news for you.
Thank you, Ashlee. Ashlee
Going to
Haze
be
speaks.
very rare that, yeah. So and I actually have it is one of my guiding lights for my life as I think about justice as a person of color and as a woman. One of the ways I find justice is in doing the things that I like to do and not doing many of the things that I don't like to do. That is liberation for me. And so I do this because I love it.
As we close, do you by chance have a little short poem that you could sorbet our moment with to take us out?
Ooh, Navé.
You like that, I know.
You are one of the few exceptions I'll make. Let's see. Do I have any haiku? Haiku is one of my favorite forms. Short poems, 575, 5 syllables for the first, seven for the second, and five for the third. So, haiku, forgive yourself for not being who or what you thought you'd be by now.
Ashlee Haze, thank you for being with us on Twice 5 Miles Radio. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, James Navé, for having me. I wish you all the best. Have a great rest of your day.
And there you go, my friends. Thus concludes my conversation with the poet Ashlee Haze. As I said earlier in the show, Ashlee has competed on the slam stage at the Leaf Global Arts Festival. She won't be with us this October. We will have 12 great slam poets on stage, and maybe if you have some time in October to join us on the Saturday night at the Leaf Festival, you'll be able to see what they do and get a sense of what Ashlee's done on the stage as well. Thanks to our conversation with Ashlee, you now have a better sense of how poems can save lives. She talked a great deal about the idea of reading intimately, and you got a sense of that when she read Temple, her poem about church. I really enjoyed that. I hope you did too. And you also know that a modern form of poetry can be invented, as Jericho Brown invented the duplex. And finally, I hope you enjoyed our conversation around social media, marketing and sales, how to create podcasts, a little bit of sense of what kind of technology is required or not required, depending on how you want to go about it. And I loved how Ashlee Haze laughed so much when she said, if you're thinking about making a fortune in this business, think again. And it is true. If you're going to do any kind of radio stuff, you got to do it for love, because that's how you get completely fulfilled by doing it. The main thing I have learned doing this show, Twice 5 Miles Radio, over the last 8 years, I've learned how to listen. I've also learned how when two people come together in a conversation, they naturally create a story. Every story you tell has a beginning, a middle, and an end. First, it might not be obvious. How many times have you been in a conversation and afterwards you realize your conversation had a beginning, a middle, and an end? And another thing that makes poems and stories work, contrast. For example, free versus trapped. How about order versus chaos? Everybody knows up versus down, or dark and light. Frightening, comforting, beautiful, ugly, serious, ridiculous, helpful, obstructive. And those kind of contrasts exist in poems all the time. Say The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. You've got two roads and you got to take one and you have to leave the other one behind. One leads you west and the other one leads you east. Destiny awaits in both choices, and yet you can only make one. The contrast, which will be the better choice. And of course, when you make a choice based on the opposites, on contrast, will it be good for me? Will it be bad for me? You can't predict the future, so you really can't know. What you can know, you can play around with all those contrasts and make something really interesting happen. For example, in Ashlee Haze's poem Temple, at the end, the man is peeking out, looking at something. There's the contrast. He should be praying, but I wonder what kind of big or little God he's looking at while he's supposed to be praying in church. Well, we'll never know, but there is a bit of mystery there. So that's what makes poetry, that's what makes storytelling, and that's what makes a really good conversation. And so before I say goodbye and close the show, I'd like to do something that I like to do now and then, an improvisational poem off the top of my head. I'm just going to let something spontaneous come out. I have no idea what it will be, so here goes. Along the sweet river, after time passes between your days and the days of those you've known, can you relax for a moment and sing a small song to the high sky hanging above you, all blue and golden and cloudy in its anticipation of who you might become? Are you willing to allow your voice to make such a leap in the moments before you go forward to where you're unsure of in the days that come before you? And so that's a little improvisational poem that I just pulled out of my imagination. That's what you get when you let your imagination swirl around a bit. Just trust it. You never know what might come. You try it. See what happens. Meanwhile, thank you ever so much for listening to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Navé, always airing first on WPVMLP Asheville 103.7 and streaming online, WPVMFM.org, the voice of Asheville, heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song. WalterParks.com for more on Walter's music. Thank you, Devine Dial, for managing WPVM-FM. Robin Collier, thank you for managing KCEI. Devine Dial is in Asheville, and Robin Collier is in Taos, New Mexico. Glad to have these stations to broadcast on. Much, much appreciated. If you'd like to reach me, Navé at jamesnavé.com. Navé is spelled N-A-V-E. I would love to hear from you. What kind of poetics are you up to these days? I'd like to know. Navé at jamesnavé.com. Reminding you, we are sponsored by the Imaginative Storm Writing Project. If you'd like to improve your writing chops, imaginativestorm.com is a great place to go. Would love to have you be part of that community. I enjoy doing the Imaginative Storm work. That's one of the reasons why I was able to generate that improvisational poem. So with that, once again, thanks for listening, and I do hope you return sometime soon. Until then, maybe we will catch each other on that turnaround somewhere down the line.